the family section. Man took his son fishing one day, and after a few hours in the boat with not much to do, the son started asking his father questions. "How does this boat float?" he asked. The man thought about it and said, "I don't really know, son." "Well, how do fish breathe underwater?" His dad scratched his head. "Well, I guess I don't know the answer to that one either." "Why is the sky blue?" And the father said, "I really don't know, son." And the boy began to worry about his dad getting upset with all of his questions and said, "Do you mind me asking questions, Dad?" His father reassured him and said, "Son, of course not. If you don't ask questions, you'll never learn anything." I think that's a good little story. Now, I may not be able to answer your questions, but anytime you have a question in our class, feel free to ask it, because there will be somebody who will be able to shed some light on it maybe. And we can all study God's Word together to that end. That's one of the wonderful things about Bible classes. I grew up going to a Bible class on Sunday night. We didn't have preaching on Sunday night at Antioch in those days unless Brother Fred Evans came or some special speaker would come and be invited maybe to speak on a Sunday night. But most of the time, Mr. Homer Fox taught a Bible class, and we did workbooks. We did that for years and years and years. And from the time I can remember until I left home, we went all the way through the New Testament. Studied all the way through the New Testament. That's a good way. Then that was just questions and answers, questions and answers. Everybody in the class would read a question and give the answer to it. Cite the scripture reference and so on. It's a good way to study the Bible. We're studying Matthew. I was closing out chapter 16. There was a thing or two that I put an asterisk beside. I wanted to go back and talk about. When Jesus said, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Those last three words I want you to think about. Now, those three words are, the two major ones are follow me. Who said that? Jesus did, didn't he? He said, follow me. Think about all the things that people follow today. Jesus didn't say, follow the crowd. There's a lot of people that do follow the crowd. I believe it's Exodus 23:2 that says, follow not a multitude to do evil. But so many people, even in religion, follow the majority. They follow the crowd. What is everybody else doing? If that's what everybody else is doing, that's what I need to do. Religiously, as well as in reference to other things. Jesus didn't say follow your conscience. I've had several people in the years that I've been preaching tell me, preacher, I think that you'll be all right if you just follow your conscience. Jesus didn't say follow your conscience. He said follow me. Follow me. And notice he didn't say follow your heart. I hear a lot of people today saying, well, I think if you just follow your heart, you'll be all right. I know some people that have said that, you know. Just wherever the Lord leads me, they say sometimes, and the Lord doesn't lead them where they're going. He's not leading them because they're in direct contradiction to what He tells them to do. We're to follow Jesus, and we can only know what Jesus wants us to do by studying what He tells us to do. We need to follow Him. Any of you have any comments about that? Another verse that I wanted to look at for just a moment, briefly from chapter 16, and that fan keeps blowing my Bible together. In verse 25, he said, for whosoever will save his life shall lose it, and whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. Now, that last part of the verse, whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. That does refer, I think, to dying a martyr's death. But that's not the only way that you can lose your life for Jesus' sake. Let me give you an example. Think about Saul of Tarsus. His life completely changed, didn't it? He had everything that you could think of from a Jewish standpoint going for him. And all of that he was willing to give up. He gave up power. He gave up prestige. He had all the perks that the Jewish leaders would enjoy. Power, position, glory, honor. All of that was coming to him. He was an up-and-coming star in Jewish circles. But he was willing to count all of that loss and to literally lose his life to follow the Lord. He came very near being killed. He was stoned. There were those who laid wait for him in Damascus before he left there. You know, he was let down over the wall. And there were people, there was a large group of men who took an oath that if it was the last thing they did, they were going to kill Saul. They were going to kill Paul. And that's when he went with that huge armed guard. Horsemen, footmen, all kinds of soldiers were guarding this man. Because there was a rumor, it wasn't just a rumor, it was the truth, that these people had said, we'll kill him if it's the last thing we do. Now, that's what Saul, that's how he lost his life for Jesus' sake. He would eventually die a martyr's death in Rome. But he lost his life for Jesus' sake by becoming a faithful Christian. And we can lose our life the same way in serving the Lord. And then we can die in Him and have a wonderful assurance that we can live with Him eternally. Paul would say, for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. He said to die is gain because of all the things he was suffering, all the trials that he was going through. It would be better from that standpoint, physical point, just to die and go on and be with the Lord. But he said, for me to live is gain for those who depended upon him to teach them the truth, and so on. Those were a couple of things. And then verse 27 reveals the supreme motivation for following the Lord, even to the point of losing our lives. Notice he said in verse 27, for the Son of Man, that's Jesus the Christ now, shall come. The Son of Man shall come. What's he talking about? He's talking about it coming again. John 14, he said, I will come again. The Son of Man shall come in the glory of His Father. And we're going to be studying a little bit tonight about the Transfiguration, hopefully. That was a glorious scene. But you think about when Jesus comes again in the glory of His Father. What a coming and a sight that will be for the eyes of those who are alive and remain to observe. And, of course, those who have died in Christ, they're going to have the opportunity to see that too. They're going to be raised from the dead and participate. Notice He will be coming with His angels, the heavenly host. How grand that's going to be. And here's the primary point. And then He shall reward. That's going to be the reward of justice. It's going to be an equitable retribution that the Lord is going to give to every man. That's every person. Man is used there of mankind. That includes females as well as males. And He shall reward every one according to his works. The type of works he's done will determine the reward received. Those that have done good under the resurrection of life, those that have done evil under the resurrection of condemnation. John 5:28 and 29. So this is the great motivation for being willing to do what Jesus just talked about in reference to losing your life for His sake. He's going to reward us, and it will be just and equitable. Verse 28 reveals the nearness of the coming kingdom and the blessedness of those who would witness it. And the verse might imply that some would die as a result of their being a part of the kingdom. Notice he said, there be some of you standing here that shall not taste death. To taste death is to experience death. That's a way, you taste things. Barbara made some vegetable soup the other day. Boy, that was so tasty, and I just couldn't wait hardly to sit down to the table and eat some of that. And I've eaten it another time since too. But, we sample things. Well, death might be bitter, might be sweet. If you're ready to go, what better thing could happen? Because we'll get to be with the Lord. And Jesus will reward us according to that. But notice that here we have a coming of the Son of Man in His kingdom. This is not the coming that is described in the preceding verse when He comes to reward everyone according to the lives that they have lived. So you have to decide from the context of a passage exactly what coming is being discussed. Jesus is going to come in His kingdom. And this is not a reference to the destruction of Jerusalem or of His second coming, as sometimes people say. But He's coming to rule and reign in His kingdom, the church. If you go back and read Acts 2, begin about verse 33, read on a couple or three verses, you'll find that Peter describes Jesus as ruling and reigning at the right hand of God over His kingdom. The kingdom would be established prior to Jerusalem's destruction, so it can't be talking about that. And when He comes the second time, Jesus didn't know when He was coming the second time. So He's not talking about that either. Talking about the coming in the kingdom. All right. Do any of you have any thoughts or closing comments on Matthew 16 or anything that we've introduced tonight? Okay. Let's look at it. Look at a brief outline of chapter 17. First 8 verses deals with the transfiguration. And verses 9 through 13 deal with the charge that Jesus gave the 3 apostles who were with Him to remain silent about what they had observed and heard on that occasion. Then in verses 14 through 21, you have the healing of the lunatic. The son of a man his dad described him as a lunatic. He was possessed by a demon. Some of the disciples tried to cast out the demon but couldn't. And it wasn't until Jesus came that he was healed. Now, these who were probably being asked to cast the demon out were probably all or some of the other apostles, the other 9. There were 3 that was on the Mount of Transfiguration. Where were those other 9? They would have been somewhere else, not there. And then you have in verses 22 through 23 the revelation of the ordeal and the suffering that were to come. Jesus had already told them earlier on, you'll remember, that I'm going to have to go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the leaders. He is now reminding them again of just how great an ordeal that would be. And then the last 3, 4 verses, the paying of the tribute money for tax purposes, verses 24 through 27. It's interesting that, I don't know how significant it is, but the chapter opens with a scene on a high mountain and ends down in the valley. And I think that's something for us to think about, because that's the way life is, isn't it? Life is a series of peaks and valleys. You know, you see the graph for the stock market. It goes up, down, you know. And if you've ever been in a room, the hospital, with somebody that is not in, you know, good condition, and you see that monitor, and it just continues to go lower and lower and lower. It's not a good sign. But life is we're going to have peaks, mountaintop experiences as they're called. There's going to be a lot of times in the valleys too. Jesus spent time on mountain peaks, and he spent time in the valley too. And he's promised to be with us. We need him with us when we're on the mountaintop, because that's a time that we could become a little too proud and arrogant. So we need him there to remind us. We need to always be sure that we're walking with him during those times. And then when we go into the valleys, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Just remember that he is with us there as well. Mountaintops are often mentioned in the Bible. Mount Ararat, what happened there? Yeah, the ark landed there, didn't it? Back several years ago, there were a lot of news stories about the fact that they thought they had discovered the ark on Mount Ararat. I think there are plans for a trip maybe to be made sometime to see the replica of the ark up in, where is it, somebody? Kentucky. I thought that was right. And that would be a very interesting thing to do. But there were those, I remember using that story when it first came out about discovering the ark, and it had been frozen in a big glacier or something, you know, and they were saying that from all indications it's still there. And I remember making a point in a sermon about, you know, you just wonder if there might not be nail claw marks still visible on the ark, because I believe there were a lot of people trying to get in that ark. As that water kept rising and so on, I would say there were people who wanted to get on. They didn't believe what Noah had preached. But if it's like people today, if you've ever watched the movie The Titanic, you know how the people were about those lifeboats that were going out. But Mount Ararat is one of those. Mount Moriah, that's where Isaac was offered in Genesis 22. And this would be the place where David would make that a very prominent place. Temple would be built on it, and Jerusalem would become the capital. That would be the general area of Mount Moriah. And then there's Mount Sinai. What happened there? 10 Commandments was given. The law was given. Very, very prominent place in Israelite history. You can read Exodus 24 and Exodus 34 about that. What about Mount Nebo? Moses was buried there. We don't really know where. But he was allowed to climb to the heights of Nebo like people do the chimney tops up in the mountains and go to, well, what's the other one, the highest point? Come on, all you people that go to the mountains. Clingman's Dome. I'll get it out in a minute. Clingman's Dome. I couldn't think of that, you know. And he climbed Mount Nebo and was able to survey the Promised Land. Could see it, but never was allowed to enter. You can read about that in Deuteronomy 34. And then there's Mount Carmel. You remember what happened there? One of the great biblical stories. I'm sorry? I still didn't hear you, Brenda. No. That was out in the desert, I believe. That's where Elijah and the prophets of Baal had their confrontation. You know, that's when Elijah kind of became sarcastic and started prodding them along and saying, you know, maybe you need to cry a little louder, praying for their God to send down fire and consume the sacrifice. And, you know, and he would say, maybe your God has gone on a journey. Maybe you need to cry a little more and a little louder because he probably can't hear you. He's so far away. And then he, of course, asked for water to be poured on the altar. The sacrifice watered, and water was running in the trench around the altar that had been built. And when he prayed to God, fire came down and consumed the sacrifice, lapped up the water that was in the moat around it or the ditch that was around it. And all of that, a great victory. Prophets of Baal were defeated. A lot of great things happened on mountains. And it's an interesting study to study those. The opening scene, I think there are 3 major scenes in this chapter, Matthew 17. The opening scene is one of resplendent glory, honor, and power with Jesus in the company of the Jews' great lawgiver. That would be Moses. And the Jews' primary prophet, Elijah, there on that mountain. That would be something else. It is said that they talked. We can only suppose what they talked about. In view of the fact that Jesus has been talking to his disciples about what he is going to be going through, I've often wondered if maybe they were talking about that. Kind of comparing notes on what it would be like to suffer. And it might be very well that, you know, Moses was reminded of the fact that Jesus was the fulfillment of the type. A prophet will arise like unto Moses. And Elijah was a great prophet, but Jesus would supersede him in every possible way. So I don't know what all they talked about. We don't know for how long they talked. We do know that according, I believe it's to Luke's account, the 3 disciples, slept through some of what went on there. Have you noticed how many times they did that? 2 momentous occasions that they were with Jesus. Transfiguration and the Garden of Gethsemane. And on both occasions they slept. They were with him on one other occasion. Do you remember what it was? Just these three. When he healed or raised Jairus' daughter from the dead. They were with him. Nothing is said about them sleeping then. But 2 out of 3 times where the inner circle, Peter, James, and John, are said to be with Jesus, they were sleeping. Sometimes we go to sleep on Jesus, don't we? We can do that by just not being faithful in His service. Sometimes people go to sleep in the church building. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're unfaithful to the Lord. I don't know why Eutychus went to sleep, but he could have had good reason. I've known people going to sleep in the church building. It didn't bother me a bit, but there have been some who've gone to sleep in the church building. It really bothered me because sometimes I know the conditions. You remember Brother Deward Carver? And he went to sleep right here one morning. I mean, sound asleep. But when you realized how many times he got up during the night and helped Miss Judy and took care of her, plus working full time in the parts department at Ford Garage, I didn't have a problem with him going to sleep at all. I knew why he was asleep. But some of us were afraid to touch him because he looked like he was dead. He was supposed to help with the Lord's Supper that morning. He may have been embarrassed by it, but he didn't act like he was embarrassed. The man just couldn't help it. I knew another man who would go to sleep in church. It kind of bothered me for a while. I was a real young preacher at that time, until there was somebody who told me, if you go down to his farm, you may see him sitting out in the middle of the field on his tractor, sound asleep, with the motor running. He had a health condition that caused him to do that. And when you understand that, now Eutychus may have had something like that going on. We don't know why he went to sleep. But I just throw that out there to help us all to realize we need to find out what's going on before we judge people too harshly. But let's not go to sleep on Jesus in the sense of becoming unfaithful and just not doing the work that we're able to do. Yeah.
I was just thinking about two spiritually momentous occasions. Jesus in Gethsemane and the Mount of Transfiguration, and they go to sleep, okay? And then the one thing in their lives that was really momentous, on the Sea of Galilee, when the storm, Jesus is asleep.
How about that? That is a good point.
It's amazing that the difference between what Jesus was considering very important and critical and what his apostles were thinking very important and critical. And in all those instances, the opposite side was asleep.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Now, that's what I was talking about a while ago, about things you learn in class. These things just keep coming up. So I know all of you have great thoughts like that. So share them with us. Anything further? Now that's the opening scene. You have the what I call the mid scene is about the power of Jesus in casting out a difficult to expel demon. When we get to that, you'll find out that Jesus said this kind comes out only by fasting and prayer. Takes something extra special. And we'll talk more about that next time, Lord willing. Why could they not cast him out? Jesus tells us why. He says, because of your unbelief. How many times did he have to chastise his disciples, the 12, who were so close to him and who had been involved with so many miracles? And yet their faith was still not at the level the Lord wanted it to be. And I think we can learn a lesson from that. You know, after years of Bible study and so on, and faithful service in the Lord's kingdom, our faith needs to be stronger. We need to be a people who have strong faith. And then the closing scene has Jesus as a tax-paying servant of a foreign power. He paid taxes to the Roman government. He said so that nobody will be offended, you know. He was the ruler, creator of everything, and yet he pays taxes. And you'll remember that Jesus taught a lot about being a servant. He was willing to be a servant. And he taught also, you render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. So he was here rendering unto Caesar what belonged to him. Next time I want us to answer some questions. When did the transfiguration occur? Who was with Jesus on that occasion? I want us to ask, where did it take place? Where was the Mount of Transfiguration? I think that's interesting thing, some interesting things to study. But I hope that you'll be back with us next time, and we will go through chapter 17 and deal with some of those things. Appreciate your presence and your input.